February 7th, 1943. In a concrete bunker beneath the streets of Berlin, Luftwaffe intelligence officers gathered around a wall-sized map of Western Europe. Red pins marked RAF bomber bases across England. Blue pins showed German fighter stations, but it was the cluster of black pins appearing along the English coast that made the room fall silent. Each one represented a new American bomber group. Oberst Werner Streib, a veteran night fighter pilot, stood before the map with his arms crossed. The Americans had been in the war for 14 months, but their daylight bombing campaign had barely begun. Early raids on Wilhelmshaven and Emden had been small, tentative, almost apologetic. Formations of 20 or 30 B-17 seconds escorted partway across the North Sea before turning back. The Luftwaffe had shot down several, damaged more, and sent the rest limping home. To the men in that room, the verdict seemed clear. Daylight precision bombing was a fantasy, an American delusion that would be corrected by German fighters. Streib tapped the map near Bremen. "They call them flying fortresses," he said. "But every fortress falls when you know where to strike." The room murmured in agreement. The B-17 was impressive on paper, 4 engines, 13 machine guns, a crew of 10. But to German pilots, it was simply a target. A very large, very slow target. They had already developed tactics: slash through the formation from head-on, aim for the cockpit, and break away before the gunners could track you. Simple, efficient, proven. What none of them understood yet was that the Americans weren't building bombers to avoid being shot down. They were building them to absorb punishment, keep flying, and return in numbers so vast that shooting them down wouldn't matter. The philosophy was already visible in every rivet of every B-17 rolling off assembly lines in Seattle, but it would take 2 years of blood and fire before the Luftwaffe truly comprehended what they were facing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The B-17 Flying Fortress was not an elegant machine. German pilots who first encountered it over France described it as ungainly, a collection of cylinders and wings held together by American optimism. The fuselage was wide and boxy. The tail looked like it had been borrowed from a transport plane. Compared to the sleek lines of a Messerschmitt 109 or the predatory grace of a Focke-Wulf 190, the Flying Fortress seemed almost primitive. But the Americans hadn't designed it for aesthetics. They had designed it for one purpose: to carry bombs deep into Germany and come home. Everything else, speed, agility, elegance, was secondary. The result was a machine built like a ship, slow to turn, heavy to climb, but nearly impossible to kill quickly. In early 1943, the 8th Air Force was still learning how to use it. Bombing raids were small, often fewer than 50 aircraft. Losses ran high, sometimes 15% per mission. German flak batteries and fighter squadrons tore through formations with ease. Pilots returned to England with stories of burning engines, shattered glass, and B-17 seconds spiralling out of control. The British, who had abandoned daylight bombing after catastrophic losses in 1940, watched with grim sympathy. They had tried this before. It didn't work. American generals insisted otherwise. The B-17 was designed to fight its way through. Its defensive armament, 13 50 caliber machine guns, could create overlapping fields of fire that would shred any interceptor foolish enough to linger, or so the theory went. In practice, German fighters attacked too fast for gunners to track. Messerschmitts came screaming out of the sun at 400 miles per hour, fired a 2-second burst, and vanished before the bomber's guns could swing into position. The Luftwaffe developed a term for the American bombers: Viermotorige Ziele, 4-engine targets. It was dismissive, almost mocking. Luftwaffe aces, who had learned their trade over Britain and Russia, saw the B-17 seconds as little more than practice for younger pilots. Lieutenant Colonel Egon Meyer, one of Germany's top fighter pilots, told his squadron, "They are large, they are slow. If you cannot hit them, you should not be flying." But Meyer was also observant. He noticed something the others missed. When B-17 seconds were hit, they didn't always fall. Engines burst into flames, but the bomber kept flying. Wings were shredded by cannon fire, yet the aircraft stayed in formation. He watched one fortress absorb over 200 bullet strikes and still make it back across the channel. The machine's durability puzzled him. It shouldn't be possible. In March 1943, German intelligence recovered the wreckage of a B-17F shot down near Lorient. Engineers from the Luftwaffe's technical division examined the remains with the same methodical precision they had once applied to captured Spitfires and Hurricanes. What they found surprised them. The airframe was overbuilt, control cables were duplicated, fuel tanks were self-sealing, even the oxygen system had redundant lines. One engineer wrote in his report, "The aircraft is designed with the assumption that it will be damaged. This is not confidence. This is pessimism made structural." He meant it as criticism, but he had identified the core of American bomber philosophy. The B-17 wasn't built to avoid damage, it was built to survive it. By spring, the raids were growing larger. 50 bombers became 100, then 150. The Luftwaffe adapted quickly. Fighter groups concentrated near the German border, waiting for the bombers to cross into range. Without fighter escorts, the B-17 seconds were vulnerable. German pilots attacked in waves, peeling off one by one to fire, reload, and attack again. On April 17th, a raid on Bremen lost 16 bombers out of 115. The 8th Air Force called it acceptable losses. The crews called it a bloodbath. Still, the Americans kept coming. Each week brought new groups, new crews, new bombers painted in olive drab with bright squadron markings. To the Luftwaffe, it began to feel less like a campaign and more like an industrial process. For every bomber they destroyed, 2 more appeared. The German High Command remained confident. Production reports from Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt factories showed steady output. Pilot training programs, though strained, were still producing experienced aviators. The arithmetic seemed favorable. If the Americans lost 15% per mission, they couldn't sustain the campaign. Mathematics would force them to stop. But those calculations rested on a flawed assumption. They assumed American production was limited. It wasn't. In Seattle, Boeing's Plant 2 was completing one, B-17, every 90 minutes. In Long Beach, Douglas Aircraft was doing the same, with a variant called the B-24 Liberator. Across the United States, factories that had once built cars and tractors now built bombers. The scale was incomprehensible to German analysts. When intelligence reports estimating American bomber production reached Berlin, they were dismissed as exaggeration. No nation could build aircraft that quickly. The numbers had to be inflated. Propaganda meant to demoralize. But the numbers were real. By mid-1943, the United States was producing more heavy bombers in a single month than Germany could manufacture in 6. The Luftwaffe didn't yet see the storm gathering. They saw individual raids, individual losses, individual victories. What they couldn't see was the industrial machine behind those bombers, a system designed not for elegance or efficiency, but for overwhelming, relentless, unstoppable mass production. In June 1943, General Eker, commander of the 8th Air Force, stood in a briefing room in England and studied casualty reports. Losses remained high. Morale was fragile. But he knew something the Germans didn't. Reinforcements were coming. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. He turned to his staff and said, "Gentlemen, we are not trying to fight a clever war. We are trying to fight a war the enemy cannot outlast." That sentence captured the entire American strategy. The B-17 wasn't a weapon of finesse, it was a weapon of endurance. And endurance, in the brutal arithmetic of industrial war, always wins. Outside, across the English countryside, new airfields were being carved from farmland. Runways stretched for miles. Hangars rose like steel cathedrals. Every week, more bombers arrived, their aluminum skin gleaming under grey skies. The crews were young, many had never seen combat. But they climbed into their aircraft with the same determination as those who had flown before them. To the Luftwaffe, watching from across the channel, the American build-up was visible, but incomprehensible. They didn't understand what they were seeing. It wasn't an air force. It was an industrial avalanche, gathering speed, preparing to bury everything in its path. And the only warning they had was the distant drone of engines, growing louder each day. The men who flew the B-17 seconds came from small towns most Germans had never heard of. They were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California. Few had ever flown an aircraft before the war. Most had never left their home states. Yet by the summer of 1943, they were piloting 70,000-pound bombers into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. The training pipeline was ruthless. Pilots learned to fly multi-engine aircraft in Texas and Arizona, practicing formation flying, navigation, and emergency procedures. Gunners trained in Florida, firing at targets towed behind other planes. Bombardiers studied ballistics and wind drift in New Mexico. Navigators memorized European geography in classrooms that smelled of chalk and coffee. Within months, these strangers were forged into crews, 10 men whose survival depended on absolute trust. When they arrived in England, they found a country preparing for invasion. American air bases covered the eastern counties like a sprawling industrial city. Nissen huts housed thousands of airmen. Mess halls served meals around the clock. Briefing rooms displayed maps of targets deep inside Germany, cities whose names the crews struggled to pronounce. The mood was tense, purposeful, and strangely optimistic. The missions followed a pattern. Wake at 4 in the morning, breakfast of powdered eggs and weak coffee. Briefing at 5, where intelligence officers unveiled the day's target. Then the wait, watching the sky, hoping the weather would hold. If the mission was on, the crews climbed into trucks and rode out to the hardstands, where their bombers waited, engines cold, skin covered in morning dew. Pre-flight checks took an hour. Pilots tested controls. Engineers inspected engines. Gunners loaded ammunition belts, each 50 caliber round the size of a finger. The bombardier armed the bombs, massive cylinders hanging in the belly of the aircraft. Everything had to be perfect. A single malfunction at 25,000 feet could mean death. Takeoff was the most dangerous part. Fully loaded, a B-17 weighed 65,000 pounds. It needed every foot of runway to claw into the air. One by one, bombers roared down the tarmac, engines screaming, tail lifting, wheels leaving the ground. The pilots held the yoke steady, fighting the weight, coaxing the machine upward. Sometimes a bomber didn't make it. An engine failed. The aircraft settled back onto the runway, skidded into a field, and exploded in a ball of fire. The rest kept flying. Once airborne, the bombers circled for an hour, assembling into formation. This was not the loose, improvised flying of fighter pilots. This was geometry. Lead bombers fired coloured flares. Groups stacked into layers. Wings formed boxes. The entire formation, sometimes 200 aircraft, arranged itself into a defensive wall of steel and guns. From the ground, it looked like a vast machine, methodical and inhuman. The flight to Germany took hours. The Channel disappeared behind them. The Dutch coast appeared ahead, a thin line of land and flak. German radar tracked them from the moment they left England. By the time they crossed into occupied Europe, Luftwaffe fighter groups were already scrambling. Inside the bombers, the temperature dropped. At 25,000 feet, the air was 30 degrees below zero. Crewmen wore electrically heated suits, but the cold still crept in through gaps in the fuselage. Oxygen masks fogged. Fingers went numb. The only sound was the roar of engines and the crackle of static on the intercom. Then the fighters came. The first. Attacks were always the worst. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs appeared as dots on the horizon, closing with terrifying speed. They rolled into attack runs, wings sparkling with cannon fire. The bombers' gunners opened up, tracers arcing through the sky. The noise was deafening. 50 caliber machine guns hammered. Shells punched through aluminum. Men screamed over the intercom. "Fighter! 12 o'clock high! Got him! He's coming around again! The German pilots were good. They knew where to strike. The nose of the B-17 was lightly armed. A head-on attack gave them a clear shot at the cockpit and the bombardier. If they hit the pilot, the bomber fell. If they missed, they flashed past at a combined closing speed of 600 miles per hour, gone before the gunners could adjust. But the bombers didn't break formation. That was the key to survival. A lone B-17 was helpless. A tight formation was a fortress. Overlapping fields of fire created a defensive wall. German pilots who tried to linger in the kill zone were shredded by concentrated fire. The tactic worked, but it required discipline. Pilots had to hold formation even as the aircraft beside them exploded. They had to keep flying straight and level while cannon shells tore through their wings. Some couldn't do it. They broke away, dove for safety, and were picked off by German fighters waiting below. Others held steady, teeth clenched, hands locked on the yoke, trusting the system. Most of the time, it worked. Sometimes it didn't. By the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force was learning lessons written in blood. Formations had to be tighter, defensive fire had to be coordinated, damaged bombers had to be protected. Every mission refined the tactics. Every loss taught a new rule. The Germans, too, were learning. But they were learning the wrong lesson. Luftwaffe pilots believed that if they pressed their attacks harder, the Americans would stop coming. Squadron commanders urged aggression. Hit them fast, hit them hard, and they will break. Raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg in August 1943 cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers in a single day. It was the worst loss of the war. Crews returned, traumatized. Some refused to fly again. But the raids didn't stop. New bombers arrived. New crews replaced the dead. The formations grew larger. By autumn, the 8th Air Force was launching raids of 300 bombers. The Luftwaffe scrambled every available fighter, throwing wave after wave into the formations. They shot down dozens. It made no difference. In October, a Luftwaffe intelligence report noted with alarm, American bomber strength has not decreased despite heavy losses. Reinforcements exceed attrition. The analyst who wrote it underlined the final sentence twice. We are not winning a war of attrition. We are losing one. But the High Command ignored the warning. They believed that one more concentrated effort, one more devastating blow, would break the Americans. They didn't understand that the B-17 seconds weren't just bombers. They were symbols of an industrial system that could replace loss faster than loss could occur. For every bomber destroyed over Germany, 3 more were being built in Seattle. The American crews didn't know the numbers. They only knew that every day, more bombers took off. Every day, fewer came back. And every day, they climbed into the cockpit and flew anyway. Not because they were fearless. Because they believed that their sacrifice mattered, that each bomb dropped shortened the war, that the mission, however brutal, was just. That belief, more than any machine or tactic, was what the Luftwaffe couldn't counter. It wasn't courage born of desperation. It was the quiet, relentless determination of people who had been told they were building something worth dying for. And they believed it. By late 1943, the bomber offensive had become a harder, grinding, mechanical process. Death was routine, loss was expected. But the missions continued, each one adding another layer to the pressure crushing Germany's war machine. The Luftwaffe could win individual battles, but they were losing the war, bomber by bomber, mission by mission, one formation at a time. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Winter 1943 brought no relief. The bombing raids continued through ice storms and snow, through weather that would have grounded any air force of an earlier era. The B-17 formations ploughed through clouds thick as concrete, navigating by dead reckoning and radio beacons, emerging over targets obscured by industrial haze and smoke from previous raids. The accuracy suffered. Many bombs fell wide, but the sheer weight of explosives compensated for the imprecision. On the ground, the Luftwaffe's fighter groups were beginning to fray. Pilot losses mounted. Experienced squadron leaders who had survived Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain were dying over Germany. Their replacements were teenagers with 40 hours of flight training, barely enough time to learn basic aerobatics, let alone the complex geometry of attacking a bomber formation. Still, the young pilots tried. They followed the same tactics their predecessors had used, diving out of the sun, targeting the lead bombers, aiming for the engines. But the B-17 seconds kept coming. Even when hit, they stayed in formation. Engines feathered. Propellers stopped spinning. The bombers limped home on 3 engines, sometimes 2. Gunners told stories of fortresses flying back to England with half a wing missing, tail sections shot away, fuselages riddled with holes large enough to crawl through. The Germans began to realize they were fighting something they didn't fully understand. These weren't fragile aircraft held together by luck. They were machines designed to absorb catastrophic damage and survive. Every structural element was redundant. Fuel lines were self-sealing. Control cables were duplicated. Even the electrical systems had backup generators. The bomber didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to keep flying. Luftwaffe engineers examined more wreckage. They measured the thickness of aluminum skin, studied the layout of defensive guns, analyzed the placement of armor plate protecting the crew. Their reports grew longer, more detailed, and more disturbing. One wrote, "The bomber is not designed for elegance. It is designed for industrial war. Every component anticipates failure and compensates for it. This is engineering philosophy we do not possess." He was right. German aircraft were masterpieces of efficiency, light, fast, and lethal when flown by skilled pilots. But they required skill. The Focke-Wulf 190 was a superb dogfighter in the hands of an ace. In the hands of a novice, it was unforgiving. Messerschmitt 109 had a narrow landing gear that caused accidents even among experienced pilots. These were machines built for experts. The B-17 was built for everyone. Its controls were heavy but predictable. Its engines were powerful but simple. A pilot with 200 hours could fly it almost as well as one with 2,000. That difference mattered. As German pilot quality declined, American pilot quality remained constant. The training pipeline in the United States produced crews faster than combat could consume them. By early 1944, the imbalance was becoming visible. Luftwaffe squadrons that once fielded 30 fighters now struggled to put up 15. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Spare parts were scavenged from wrecks. Mechanics worked through the night to keep machines airborne. Meanwhile, American bomber groups grew larger. 8th Air Force added a 9th, 10th, 11th bomb group. The formations that had once numbered 100 aircraft now numbered 300, then 400. The Luftwaffe adapted desperately. They concentrated fighters near key targets, abandoning the defense of less critical areas. They developed new weapons, rocket-propelled projectiles fired from beyond machine gun range, heavy cannons mounted on modified fighters. Some of these worked. Most didn't. The rockets were inaccurate. The cannons slowed the fighters, making them vulnerable. Every solution created new problems. And still the bombers came. January 1944, February, March. Each month brought more raids, deeper into Germany, striking factories, rail yards, oil refineries, the strategic targets that fed the German war machine. The Luftwaffe threw everything into the defense. On some days, they shot down 40 bombers. On others, 50. It felt like victory. But the math told a different story. In March alone, the United States delivered 230 new B-17 seconds to England. Losses for the month, 97. The balance was positive. Every month, the 8th Air Force grew stronger. Every month, the Luftwaffe grew weaker. The arithmetic was pitiless. Then came the fighters. In late February 1944, long-range American escort fighters began appearing over Germany. P-51 Mustangs, equipped with drop tanks that extended their range to Berlin and beyond. For the first time, the bombers weren't alone. The fighters stayed with them, all the way to the target and back. Luftwaffe interceptors that once attacked with impunity now had to fight their way through screens of Mustangs. The change was immediate. Bomber losses dropped. Fighter losses soared. Luftwaffe pilots who had spent years perfecting the art of attacking bombers now found themselves hunted. The Mustang was faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots eager to prove themselves. German squadrons that had once dominated the sky were torn apart. By April, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was in crisis. Experienced pilots were dead, grounded by wounds. Fuel reserves were dwindling. Aircraft production couldn't keep pace with losses. And the bombers, those massive, ungainly four-engine fortresses the Germans had once mocked, were now crossing Germany in formations so large they stretched across the horizon. On May 8, 1944, over 900 American heavy bombers struck targets across Germany. The Luftwaffe managed to shoot down 33. It was their best effort in weeks. But that same day, another 75 bombers arrived in England as replacements. The net gain favoured the Americans. It always did. A Luftwaffe pilot, writing in his diary that night, captured the despair spreading through the fighter squadrons. "We shoot them down by the dozen, and they return by the 100. It is not war anymore. It is mathematics." He was right. The air war over Europe had become an equation. On one side, German skill, courage, and desperation. On the other, American production, endurance, and relentless numerical superiority. The outcome was no longer in doubt. It was simply a matter of time. By summer 1944, the air war had shifted from a contest of tactics to a war of exhaustion. The Luftwaffe wasn't being outfought. It was being buried under the weight of numbers it could never match. Every morning, radar stations across occupied Europe detected new formations assembling over England. Every afternoon, those formations crossed the Channel, their contrails drawing white lines across blue skies. The bomber streams were so large now that they took hours to pass over a single point. German civilians watched from below, counting the aircraft until they lost track. Some stopped counting at 200, others at 500. The exact number didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the realization that the sky itself had become American territory. Inside the bombers, crews had developed their own rituals. Some carried lucky charms, photographs of sweethearts, letters from home, others prayed. Many simply went quiet, staring out at the formation around them, watching the vapor trails from other aircraft, waiting for the fighters that would inevitably come. The fear never disappeared. It just became routine. The targets grew more ambitious. Berlin, Munich, Vienna, cities that once seemed untouchable, were now visited weekly by formations numbering over 700 aircraft. The bombing wasn't precise. Clouds obscured targets, smoke from fires obscured aim points, but the cumulative effect was devastating. Factories that produced ball bearings, aircraft engines, and synthetic fuel were pounded into rubble. Rail yards became tangled wreckage. The infrastructure that sustained Germany's war effort was being systematically dismantled. Albert Speer, the Reich's Minister of Armaments, watched the production reports with growing alarm. Tank output was falling. Aircraft deliveries were behind schedule. Fuel stocks were critically low. In a meeting with Hitler in June, he presented a chart showing the correlation between Allied bombing raids and German industrial decline. Hitler barely glanced at it. "Production will recover," he said. "It always does." But it didn't. The bombing had crossed a threshold. Factories could be rebuilt, but the skilled workers killed in raids couldn't be replaced. The machine tools destroyed by high explosives couldn't be replicated quickly. The coal mines flooded by disrupted drainage systems couldn't resume production overnight. Each raid compounded the damage of the previous one, creating a cascade of failures that rippled through the entire economy. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and aircraft, began to make desperate choices. Fighter groups were pulled from the Eastern Front, leaving German armies vulnerable to Soviet air attack. Training programs were shortened, pushing pilots into combat after barely 20 hours in their aircraft. Some didn't survive their first mission. Others lasted a week. The few veterans who remained flew until they were killed, because there was no one else. By July, the Luftwaffe's High Command issued a directive that revealed how far they had fallen. Fighters were ordered to ignore escort aircraft and focus entirely on the bombers. "The bombers are the threat," the order read. "Destroying fighters achieves nothing if the bombers reach their targets." It was a rational decision. It was also an admission of defeat. German pilots obeyed, but the cost was horrific. Attacking through screens of Mustangs and Thunderbolts meant accepting catastrophic losses. On some missions, entire squadrons were wiped out. 30 fighters took off, 5 returned. The math was unsustainable, but there was no alternative. Letting the bombers through unopposed meant the destruction of Germany's war machine. Fighting back meant the destruction of the Luftwaffe. Either way, Germany lost. The American crews saw the desperation in the tactics. Luftwaffe fighters came in, closer now, accepting more risk, firing until their ammunition was gone. Some rammed bombers in suicide attacks, their aircraft disintegrating in explosions that took both planes down. It was courage born of hopelessness, and it changed nothing. On August 1st, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its largest mission of the war. Over 1,000 heavy bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters, struck targets across Germany. The Luftwaffe managed to shoot down 32. But that same day, American factories completed production on 47 new B-17 seconds. The arithmetic was unchanged. For every bomber destroyed, more than one was built. In a bombed-out command post near Brunswick, a Luftwaffe intelligence officer updated his charts. He tracked bomber losses, replacement rates, and projected American strength for the next 6 months. When he finished, he stared at the numbers in silence. Then he wrote a single sentence in the margin. "We are not fighting an air force. We are fighting a factory." His report was forwarded to Berlin, where it joined hundreds of others, warning that the war was lost. None of them mattered. The Reich's leadership had stopped listening to facts. They spoke, instead of miracle weapons, of jet fighters and rockets that would turn the tide. The Messerschmitt 262 jet was entering service, a revolutionary aircraft that could outrun any Allied fighter. But it was too late and too few. The Americans didn't need to match German innovation. They just needed to keep building. And they did. In September, Boeing delivered its 5,000th B-17. Douglas Aircraft delivered its 3,000th B-24 Liberator. The combined output of American bomber production now exceeded 1,500 aircraft per month. Germany, by comparison, produced fewer than 400 fighters. The disparity was so extreme that Luftwaffe pilots began to speak of the American bomber formations as Die Wolke, the cloud. It wasn't a metaphor. The formations were so dense that they literally obscured the sky. From the ground, they looked like a moving storm, darkening the sun, their engine noise a sustained roar that shook windows and rattled nerves. German civilians who had once believed in victory now understood that defeat was inevitable. The bombers proved it every day. They appeared in numbers that shouldn't have been possible, flying in formations that covered miles of sky, dropping tonnage that exceeded the total weight of all bombs dropped on Britain during the Blitz. The sheer scale was incomprehensible. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting a purely defensive war. Offensive operations had ceased. Every fighter was committed to protecting German cities and industries. But even that was failing. The Americans bombed during the day, the British bombed at night. There was no respite. The Luftwaffe couldn't defend everywhere simultaneously. They had to choose, and every choice meant abandoning something, to destruction. In October, a formation of over 1,200 American bombers struck oil refineries at Leuna and Merseburg. The Luftwaffe concentrated everything they had, nearly 400 fighters. The battle lasted 3 hours. German pilots fought with a ferocity born of desperation, pressing attacks through walls of defensive fire. They shot down 43 bombers, their highest score in months. But the refineries were destroyed, and within a week, American losses were replaced. The Luftwaffe's losses weren't. 57 fighters were shot down, 38 pilots killed. The survivors returned to bases where mechanics cannibalizing wrecked aircraft for spare parts. There was no more pretending. The Luftwaffe was dying. A pilot named Franz Stigler, who had once shot down 28 Allied aircraft, wrote to his brother on the Eastern Front, "The Americans have so many planes that shooting one down means nothing. It is like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. You can work forever, and the ocean remains unchanged." That image, a man with a bucket facing an ocean, captured what the Luftwaffe had become: courageous, skilled, and utterly overwhelmed. The 4-engine targets they had once mocked were now an unstoppable armada, and behind that armada stood an industrial system the Germans had never truly understood. American factories didn't just build bombers. They built the entire ecosystem that sustained them: spare parts, engines, propellers, tires, radios, instruments, ammunition. Every component was mass-produced, standardized, and shipped in quantities that defied German comprehension. A single B-17 required 15,000 individual parts. Boeing's supply chain involved over 35,000 subcontractors across the United States. When a bomber was damaged, replacement parts arrived within days. When a bomber was destroyed, a new one took its place within a week. The system was so efficient that the 8th Air Force maintained a ready reserve of bombers larger than the entire Luftwaffe fighter force. They could afford to lose aircraft at rates that would have crippled any other air force, because loss, in the American system, was simply part of the calculation. The Germans had built an air force for a short war. The Americans had built one for a long one. By late 1944, the difference was stark. Luftwaffe squadrons were shadows of their former strength. American bomb groups were stronger than ever. The balance had shifted so dramatically that the question was no longer whether Germany would lose the air war, but how much longer they could endure it. In November, Allied intelligence estimated that the Luftwaffe had fewer than 1,500 operational fighters remaining. That same month, the 8th Air Force alone operated over 2,500 heavy bombers. The numerical superiority was so overwhelming that German resistance had become symbolic. They fought because surrendering the sky meant surrendering everything. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The bomber crews knew it too. Missions were still dangerous. Men still died. But the formations were so large now that individual losses barely registered. A bomber went down, and the formation closed ranks and continued. There was no dramatic change, no moment of breakthrough, just a slow, grinding inevitability. On Christmas Eve, 1944, over 2,000 Allied bombers struck targets across Germany. The Luftwaffe managed to intercept fewer than 50. Most German fighters never even reached the formations. They were intercepted by escort fighters and shot down before they could attack. The few that broke through found themselves facing defensive fire so concentrated that survival was measured in seconds. That night, in a bunker beneath Berlin, Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, received casualty reports. He read them in silence, then threw the papers across the room. "How can we defend? Against this?" he shouted. "How can any nation defend against this?" No one answered. Because there was no answer. The Americans had turned bombing into an industrial process. They had standardized, systematized, and scaled it to levels no other nation could match. The B-17 wasn't just a bomber. It was the physical manifestation of American industrial power, and that power, once fully mobilized, was unstoppable. By the end of 1944, the air war was effectively over. The Luftwaffe still existed, but only as a remnant. The skies over Germany belonged to the Allies, and the bombers, those 4-engine targets the Germans had once dismissed, now flew in formations so vast that counting them was meaningless. They had become the new reality, a reality built not on genius or innovation, but on the simple, brutal fact of overwhelming production. The Germans had mocked them, then feared them. Now they simply endured them, knowing that every formation overhead brought Germany one day closer to collapse. The bomber offensive hadn't won the war alone, but it had made victory inevitable, and it had done so not through brilliance, but through the relentless application of numbers the enemy could never match. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe was a spent force. Fuel shortages grounded most fighters. Those that flew did so on synthetic fuel so poor that engines failed in mid-flight. Pilots who survived combat often died in crashes caused by mechanical failure. The once proud fighter arm that had terrorized Europe now struggled to put 100 aircraft in the sky. The American bomber formations, by contrast, numbered in the thousands. On clear days, the contrails from their engines stretched horizon to horizon, a white lattice against blue sky. German radar operators stopped trying to count individual aircraft. They simply reported large formations and let commanders guess the scale. The targets had shifted. With Germany's industrial base in ruins, the bombers now struck transportation networks, rail yards, bridges, canals. The goal was to paralyze movement, to trap German armies in place, unable to retreat or reinforce. It worked. Divisions on the Eastern Front received no supplies. Tank units sat immobile, their fuel exhausted. The Wehrmacht's ability to maneuver, once its greatest strength, was destroyed by bombers flying routes their crews could navigate by memory. Some Luftwaffe pilots stopped trying to intercept. They flew alongside the formations, staying out of gun range, reporting their position and heading. It was safer. It was also pointless. The information reached command posts too late to matter. By the time fighters were scrambled, the bombers had already dropped their loads and turned for home. Others fought to the end. Veterans with years of combat experience threw themselves at the formations in single-ship attacks, firing until their ammunition was gone, then ramming if they had to. It was courage without hope, a final gesture of defiance against an enemy they couldn't defeat. Most of these pilots didn't survive. The few who did returned to bases where there was no fuel to fly again. In March, the Luftwaffe attempted one last mass defense. Operation Werewolf concentrated every available fighter, nearly 300 aircraft, against a formation of 1,500 bombers, attacking Berlin. The battle was brief and one-sided. American escort fighters tore through the German formation before it could reach the bombers. In 30 minutes, over 100 Luftwaffe fighters were destroyed. The bombers completed their mission without significant loss. After that, organized resistance collapsed. German pilots still flew, still fought, but as individuals, not as a coordinated force. The system that had once made the Luftwaffe the most feared air force in the world had disintegrated. What remained were fragments, brave men flying obsolete tactics against an enemy that had already won. The final raids came in April. Berlin was burning. Soviet armies were blocks from Hitler's bunker, and still the bombers came, striking what little remained of Germany's infrastructure: roads, railways, anything that could move troops or supplies. The strikes were almost unnecessary. Germany was already defeated, but the bombers flew anyway, because that's what they were built to do. On April 20th, 1945, the 8th Air Force launched its final major raid. Over 1,300 bombers struck targets across southern Germany. The Luftwaffe didn't respond. There were no fighters left. The flak was sporadic, ammunition nearly exhausted. The bombers flew through empty skies, dropped their loads, and returned home. When the war ended 8 days later, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Its aircraft were scattered across fields, hidden in forests, or destroyed in their hangars. The pilots were dead, captured, or in hiding. The infrastructure that had sustained it, the factories, the fuel depots, the training schools, was rubble, and the bombers that had destroyed it sat on English airfields, engines silent, their work complete. 12,731 B-17 seconds had been built during the war. Over 4,600 were lost in combat, but the losses never mattered, because for every bomber that fell, 2 more were built. The Germans could never match that arithmetic. In the ruins of Berlin, an American intelligence officer interviewed a captured Luftwaffe general. He asked what had turned the air war against Germany. The general thought for a long moment, then said, "We believed we were fighting pilots. We were actually fighting factories." That sentence became the unofficial epitaph of the Luftwaffe, They had trained the best pilots in the world, developed innovative tactics, built advanced aircraft. But none of it mattered against an enemy who could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. The Americans hadn't won, through skill or courage, though they possessed both. They had won through something simpler and more devastating, the ability to build without limit. The B-17, that ungainly four-engine target the Germans had mocked in 1943, had become the symbol of that power. It wasn't the best bomber of the war. The British Lancaster carried heavier loads. The German Ju-88 was faster. But the B-17 was built in numbers that made comparisons meaningless. It was the weapon of a nation that understood that modern war wasn't won by the best machines, but by the most machines. After the war, many of the surviving B-17 seconds were scrapped. Their aluminum was melted down, recycled, turned into cars and appliances. A few were preserved in museums, their gun positions empty, their bomb bays sealed. Visitors walked through them, marveling at how cramped the interior was, how exposed the gunners must have felt. But those preserved aircraft, gleaming under museum lights, told only part of the story. The real story was in the numbers. 12,000 built, hundreds of thousands of missions flown, 291,000 tons of bombs dropped. The B-17 wasn't just an aircraft. It was an industrial process, made physical, a demonstration that war had entered a new age, where production capacity mattered more than tactical brilliance. The Luftwaffe had learned that lesson too late. They spent the war trying to shoot down individual bombers, not understanding that each one was replaceable, part of a system so vast that destroying them individually was meaningless. By the time they grasped the truth, their air force was gone, consumed by an enemy that could afford to lose and keep fighting. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.